Hi y'all, I'm Dorothea Salo, and some of you know me already, so let's just get right to talking about single sign-on, the library, and patron privacy. Here's our cast of main characters: the library, the content vendor, campus IT, and campus researcher Dr. Owl, whose pronouns are they and them. And here's our user story. Dr. Owl in their office needs a paywalled journal article that's available through the library. The library can make that happen in a couple three ways. One is IP authentication, since Dr. Owl is in their office. Dr. Owl clicks on the article link, the content vendor notices that Dr. Owl's computer's IP address belongs to campus, so the content vendor sends the article back to Dr. Owl's browser. Behind the scenes, of course, there's some work that the library and the content vendor have to do, maintaining lists of IP addresses that belong to campus. And I'm kind of oversimplifying here, but just so you have the basic idea. This kind of authentication may protect Dr. Owl's privacy or not. If Dr. Owl's office computer gets a dynamic IP address, that protects Dr. Owl to some extent. If the IP address is static, though, it's trivial for the content vendor to track Dr. Owl's reading just by using that IP address as an identifier. If Dr. Owl has unusual reading habits, they may be re-identifiable from those. More likely, though, the content vendor just re-identifies Dr. Owl with standard web bugs. And then the content vendor has a new revenue stream, selling reading behavior dossiers on library patrons to the data broker. But there's another user story we have to account for. Dr. Owl is working from home and suddenly they need an article. Since they don't live on campus, the content vendor can't recognize their computer's IP address as belonging to campus. So how does the library get Dr. Owl that article? What the library does is stand up what's called a proxy server, and here's a diagram of more or less how that works. Dr. Owl clicks a proxy link to the article. The library's proxy server doesn't know who clicked, so it asks campus IT whether the clicker is a legitimate patron. Campus IT asks Dr. Owl to log in, which they do, so campus IT reports back to the library's proxy server that it's Dr. Owl and they're legit. The library's proxy server then requests the article from the content vendor, who sees that it's the proxy server and sends it over. And finally, the library's proxy server sends the article to Dr. Owl. Let's face it, this is an ugly, fragile kludge. Nobody loves this. But there are privacy advantages to it. The big one is that Dr. Owl's identity never leaves campus, so the content vendor doesn't automatically know it. If Dr. Owl starts downloading a whole database to text mine it, the content vendor tells the library, and the library quietly tells Dr. Owl to knock it off. No lawsuits. Second, the content vendor never sees Dr. Owl's IP address, so web bugs and trackers can't nab it. And third, with lots of people on campus going through the library's proxy server to get articles, it's way harder to track Dr. Owl's reading because it's all mixed in with everybody else's. With that for background, let's talk about single sign-on systems. These both authenticate you, make you prove who you are, and authorize you to actually see and do things such as download articles to read. They are common, though far from universal, in higher ed. Some jargon, just so you've heard it. These systems rely on an XML-based communication language called SAML, and often a software rig called Shibboleth. They may be implemented through federations, such as InCommon or Open Athens. If you hear any of these weird words, just think single sign-on. You mostly won't need the details. So a couple of years ago, NISO and the STM Association designed a single sign-on system that they wanted everybody to use instead of proxy servers. Long story short, NISO released it over significant protest, mostly about privacy and security. Big disclaimer, I myself was one of the critics. The successor effort, which has more organizations participating, is called Seamless Access and has the same goals as RA21, though it did learn some things from the RA21 protests. Here's a simplified sketch of how single sign-on works in our user story. Dr. Owl clicks on an ordinary unproxied link to an article. The content vendor figures out that the clicker is from campus, so it asks campus IT who the clicker is. Campus IT has Dr. Owl log in as before, then sends metadata about Dr. Owl to the content vendor, who decides that Dr. Owl is legit and sends them the article they want. One important detail here, a lot of the communication I've drawn for you actually happens right inside Dr. Owl's browser. We'll learn more about this from John Mark Ockerbloom. This is less kludgy, less fragile, and the library doesn't even have to do anything once there's a content license. Yay, right? Right? I sure hope some of you are yelling, why is patron data going to the content vendor right now? Quick reminder that we have ethics codes that tell us we're supposed to protect the privacy and confidentiality of what people read, including from our vendors. The content vendor is not supposed to know what Dr. Owl is reading. Law enforcement at any level is definitely not supposed to know what Dr. Owl is reading. And data brokers whose whole business is selling behavior data hither and yon, and especially to governments and law enforcement, are emphatically not supposed to know what Dr. Owl is reading. But let's not panic quite yet. First, let's ask, what patron metadata even is there? Well, there's standard PII like name, email address, campus identifiers. Then there's what I'm calling persistent pseudonymous identifiers, like a number that's consistently used over time to identify a given patron without using their actual name. So like 24601, number 6, the immortal 007, and so on. You know who at least some of those numbers are, right? Yeah, so this isn't really privacy protecting. Given a persistent pseudonymous identifier, the content vendor can easily use behavioral tracking and web bugs to tie that identifier to Dr. Owl. Seamless Access calls these identifiers anonymous, and I'm really angry about that, because words mean things and PPIs are not anonymous. De-identified? Yes. Anonymous? Absolutely not. Anyway, so, third kind of metadata is often called entitlement metadata, and it's not about your identity. It's a list of the campus groups you belong to. So for Dr. Owl, that might look like they're faculty, they're tenured, they're in the ornithology department, and they've got courtesy appointments elsewhere. If Dr. Owl is the only tenured faculty member with this specific collection of appointments, well, they've basically been immediately re-identified. They're not anonymous to the content vendor at all. But just because metadata exists doesn't mean the content vendor gets to see it. So what metadata does the content vendor get? Under Seamless Access, there are three possible scenarios. One I really like, and that's the authentication-only scenario, where the only thing content vendor finds out is whether somebody actually is from campus. Then there's the very misnamed anonymous authorization scenario, where what gets communicated is entitlement metadata. How much? How re-identifiable would it be? Who knows? Seamless Access doesn't say. And finally, there's pseudonymous authorization, which sends a persistent pseudonymous identifier. Be seeing you, number 6. Either of the second two scenarios could go sour real fast. The first hard scenario is where the content vendor, in setting up single sign-on, asks campus IT to send over all available user metadata, PII, PPI, entitlements, and all, and campus IT just does that. Where's the library in this? Well, remember, the library doesn't run or control the campus single sign-on system. To keep campus IT from being lazy, they'll have to make a nuisance of themselves, and even then, campus IT may brush them off. And I hate to say it, but a lot of campus IT folks wouldn't even think twice. They're not librarians, they're cool with surveillance, they do it themselves, and they help other people on campus do it too. This slide here is from a campus chief information security officer and was part of an explanation to a Seamless Access friendly crowd how a system can use behavioral tracking, among other things, to nail so-called fraudulent downloaders. Which leads me to horror scenario 2, a repeat of the awful Aaron SWARTZ saga. The content vendor yells, "Fraudulent downloading," and calls the feds to prosecute Dr. Owl under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. The library can't handle this internally, even if it wants to, because the content vendor has either been told or figured out for itself exactly who Dr. Owl is. This scenario is written right into the RA21 goals, which were adopted wholesale by Seamless Access, end-to-end traceability for detecting fraud. And I mentioned my third horror scenario already, but making it formal. The content vendor straight up sells identified patron behavior data to the data broker, comprehensively trashing patron privacy. But surely Seamless Access says this isn't okay. Y'all, it does not say that. Not no way, not no how, not no where. But surely the content vendor knows better than to sell patron data to the data broker. Y'all, some of our content vendors are data brokers. Others have partnered with the likes of immigration enforcement. Most are covered in web bugs that send data to data brokers. Hi, content vendors listening in. I need you to know that I do not trust you with patron data. I do not think any of us should. And all the LIS research that's been done on this explains why not. And speaking of research, some stuff to read, everything by Sarah Lambden, my own physical equivalent privacy piece, a forthcoming piece in partnership that looks amazing, forthcoming model license language from Jones and Hinchliffe, and please keep an eye on Spark. And that's what I got, so I will turn it over to our next presenter.
Hello, my name is Adam Chandler. I am Director of Automation Assessment and Post-Cataloging Services in the Library Technical Services Division of the Cornell University Library.
And I'm John Mark Ockerbloom. I'm a digital library strategist at the University of Pennsylvania Libraries. And today we're going to be talking about work we're doing at our respective institutions on protecting patron privacy using single sign-on systems. This was something we realized we had to be proactive about because, as Dorothea mentioned, publishers can start having users sign on to them using our single sign-on systems without ever contacting the libraries. In fact, they don't even have to contact central IT. They're currently joining federations, single sign-on federations, like In Common that we're members of. And when they do that, they can start using our single sign-on systems for users to sign on, and they get information from us based on those default configurations of those federations. And right now, those are currently set up to overshare, at least when it comes to publishers, because we have them for personal services, which may require more information than publishers really do. So we needed to address that. And so we started doing this work. We also realized that the issue was not just with single sign-on through seamless access, but also potentially proxy servers in some cases can release personal information as well.
So in the Cornell example, this work started, we knew about this actually years ago, that we needed to pay more attention to this area, but could never quite get ourselves organized to do it. So in the fall of 2018, some of us wrote a problem statement around this problem of licensing and oversharing of information with vendors. And that ended up creating some discussions, which led to a working group that was formed and that met in 2019. Next slide, please. So the working group that we created had a broad representation, including the university librarian and colleagues in the central IT office, the privacy officer at the time, Meryl Bursick, and as well as colleagues in law and even let's see. Oh, Eliza Bettinger, who some of you might know from her DLF work in privacy. So this work, out of this work emerged 4 public-facing services. 2 of them are managed by Eliza: digital privacy literacy and privacy consultations. A third one is our library public computing, our public library machines that you can walk up to and use. That we consider that, sort of define that as a part of our privacy services now, because if you think about it, it's one of the few places in society today where one might be able to go to a computer and do some anonymous research. Then the fourth one is licensing for privacy, which this work that we're talking about today falls into. So this garish table here, I apologize for the colors, was our first round of figuring out which of the In Common vendors have been hitting the Cornell identity server. As of August 2020, we looked at the 600 or so. Jerry Shipman and CIT and myself coded these. This is the first pass. Was it for sure a library vendor, maybe a library vendor, or for sure not a library vendor? So then after we went through and did another round on the maybes and turned those into yeses or nos.
Once we'd identified library vendors that might be using single sign-on, we wanted to see what information we were sending them. There's a couple of methods you can use for doing that. One that we're using at Penn is a plugin called SAML Tracer that looks at the communication that gets sent from identity providers to service providers, which in fact goes through the user's web browser, to see what information gets sent across. This is something that individual users can also download. And it includes information about those attributes. So in this case, this service provider is getting sent my email address and my full name. That's okay in this case because the service provider is actually our Penn COVID tracker, but it's not so okay if the service provider was a publisher, and that was what was happening sometimes.
The method that John used actually wouldn't work for me because our attributes are being encrypted when they're sent out, so I couldn't read them. So we used the logs, that same set of log files that we pulled in August of 2020, and so we once we had the list of entity IDs, we were able to pull out all of the session data and create a table, this table that has the total logins in that month from 1 to 61,000 in case of easy proxy, and then also the attributes, the EduPerson attributes that were being released at that time from, in this case, 4 to 15. All of them were releasing 15 except for our easy proxy, hosted easy proxy instance. And the reason that had less is because recently it had been, we'd migrated to it and had conversations with central IT about which attributes to release.
Once you'd realize what we were sending, we then had to agree on what we would send instead. This is where it's useful to develop a set of privacy principles you can work from, so you don't have to keep having the same arguments every time a new case comes up. They can also be useful when you're negotiating with vendors or other external bodies. We brought together a number of stakeholders in the libraries, including people from IT, from electronic resources, subject librarians, and analysis. Those helped us understand the priorities the library had. Those included things like user privacy. Also brought up were things like convenience, although sometimes that's convenience for the user, and sometimes that's really just convenience for the institution. There was also issues brought up in terms of analytics. Those raised some privacy issues of their own, but when bringing them up, it's important to bring them up so you understand what people want and what limitations you have to make in order to appropriately protect people's privacy involved with that. We're still working on getting final approval for our privacy principles at Penn, but here are some of the things from our draft. We give the mission that we're aiming to connect our users with the information they need while protecting their privacy and respecting their preferences. And some of the details that go into that mean that we have to respect differences in user needs. In particular, we have to especially respect those users that will be more vulnerable if personal information were disclosed without their consent. We need to honor differences in provider trust. Just because I trust a provider doesn't necessarily mean you do, and vice versa. And we need to get consent before releasing personal data. And we realize this not only includes obvious personal data like my name or my email address, but also things like persistent pseudonymous IDs, which Dorothea, I believe, talked about a bit. And those don't necessarily name me directly, but if you pass around this ID a bunch and vendors then get a lot of events and information associated with that, they can re-identify me, and that's a problem. Our basic principle that we express in the document is that data that can identify users should not be sent without expressed informed consent. So after we developed those principles, then we had to get down to the nitty-gritty about, okay, what actually are we going to send in terms of actual variables and values? Cornell and Penn made somewhat different decisions on there, but they're similar. We're both sending across some sort of entitlement value, which simply means this is an authorized electronic resource user without going into details about who they are. We send some basic information about affiliation. It's important that we try to be very coarse grained here. If you just say they're an employee at Penn, that will not likely re-identify them. If you get very specific about where they're employed, then that's more of a problem. We're also sending a transit ID, an ID that does not go with a person, but goes with a particular session in which the person is logged in. That's useful because it doesn't persist, but it's an identifier that can be then used for reference if there are any later problems that come up with that session.
So what happens when you change the attributes? You want to do some testing ahead of time, and the way I did it in our case was I used my Mac laptop, and I had to go into the host file on my machine and change, add an entry so that when the request comes in from the resource, electronic resource, to the library, to the identity server, it gets routed to the test server instead of the production server, and the test attributes are sent out to the vendor.
At Penn, our central IT actually supports different configurations for single sign-on. So we can sign on to a test configuration that lets us try things like what happens if we send a different set of attributes, or even what happens if we use a different interface for signing on.
So when you change the attributes in production, the amount of attention you put into this probably depends on how heavily used the resource is. So that table that I showed you earlier was important to us in sort of understanding the potential implications of how many people are affected with the change. You want to do your testing, but if you miss something, you want to know what the stakes are ahead of time. And then thirdly, involving stakeholders, subject stakeholders, to be informed of the timing of the changes is also something it's probably a best practice.
And we did this at Penn, for example, when we changed the attributes for certain chemistry publishers, we invited our chemistry librarian to be part of the testing and let us know if there was any problems that would happen if we changed the attributes.
One of the benefits of this kind of work is a closer partnership with the identity management folks. It's probably a small group. And in our case, we had a series of meetings, planning project meetings, working with them, making decisions and so forth, which created more communication between us, and we know each other better. And also doing this kind of work, the library pushing for this kind of work for their own licensed resources offers a different model for the university itself, and has the potential to impact in the longer term the way the university is treating its default set of attributes.
Along with talking with central IT, we also tried to keep publishers in the loop as well. We don't necessarily ask them permission for everything that we do, but if we tell them what we're doing, that can help avert surprises. It turns out, for example, that what they might ask for initially isn't always what's required to access the resource. When we told one publisher who was asking for persistent ID, saying, well, we're not going to actually send that, is that going to cause a problem? And they said no. That was a useful revelation. One thing that helped with that, by the way, is that we offered some alternatives to it. So for instance, if they're concerned about abuse, instead of sending them a persistent ID that they can identify as the abuser, we're just sending them a session ID, and we'll say, we will respond very rapidly to any abuse reports you send us with that session ID, and basically work with central IT then to see what's going on. And because they do keep around some security information on logins for a limited period of time. And eventually, we haven't had major pushback on this yet, but we do want to know basically when publishers have a major objection, and then work out when it's appropriate to push back on what they want, or even change or reject their contracts next time it comes around to negotiating time. We've been doing this with a few different publishers now, but there are potentially many, many publishers that either are using single sign-on or could be. We'd like not to keep having to do this sort of bespoke procedure every time, because that's going to be too time consuming. So we'd like to scale up the process. There are a few ways we can do that. One is that some of these federations that publishers are dealing with, such as InCommon, they could help us plug some of these privacy holes. InCommon has a notion of different classes of service providers. So if they had a way of labeling all the publishers as in the publisher class, we could set up our single sign-on system so that by default, it just sends a reduced attribute set to anybody in the publisher class. So we'd like to work with them more closely on this. We'd also like to work more closely with other libraries, because we can band together to establish best practices, standards, and expectations, and we can go to the publishers and federations to make sure that those things actually happen that we want to have happen. Finally, ultimately, we would really like to bring the user into this and give the user real control over their consent. We don't currently do that yet at Penn and Cornell. We're just sending reduced information. But we'd like users to be able to say, with some publishers, say their society, saying, yeah, I do want to send them my identity so I can manage bibliographies or papers with them or such. But if we're going to do that, that consent can't just simply be something that gets thrown up on the screen and say, hi, click on this to get to your resource. The consent has to be fully informed. You have to understand what's being asked, who's getting this information, what they're doing with it, what they won't do with it. You also have to understand what alternatives you have to giving that information. You have to be able to freely say yes or no to any of this information that could be sent across to you. You want the system to be able to remember what you said before so you don't get bugged every time, but you want to be able to review your consent so you can say, well, actually, I've thought about it over again, and now I want to say no to this and revoke your consent going forward. This is a rather complicated set of interactions to get right. Fortunately, there's current development going on to develop systems that actually work to help give users real empowerment here. And in fact, it's even open source software, so we can further improve it. And our next speaker is going to talk about one of these systems and show it.
This presentation is intended to complement the previous presenters in this session by demonstrating actual operating open source software that enables the vision of privacy that was described earlier. That software is called CLIR, Consent-Informed Attribute Release, and it enables attribute release through both institutional and individual controls, achieving the privacy that we're looking for. We're trying to solve two sets of issues. One around the failures of proxies, the lack of privacy preserving personalization, and increasing privacy regulations. And then secondly, there's a set of issues around access control. From the very beginning, we envisioned federated access control. And I'd point out that even open access has a great need for access controls, if only to authenticate authors, limit distribution for some period of time, etc. We're trying to put all the pieces together. They're almost all together. The ITP discovery through seamless access that you heard earlier, federated identity, the move towards normative bundles of attributes that help enable those kinds of access controls. And finally, with software such as CLIR, user-managed attribute release so that the privacy fits the user. If we have time, I'll mention what's still missing from the overall vision. In terms of access control, it's been a journey. Many years ago, we did identity-based. It didn't scale and ultimately wasn't secure. We moved to role-based, which was more secure and more scalable, but it didn't give the kinds of controls we needed. We moved to attribute-based for fine-grain controls that has proven to be very challenging to manage. And so we're creating policy-based mechanisms now. The policy drives the access control and the attribute release. The major attributes that we use as a community to manage access control is edge-of-person affiliation. It's coarse grain. Those are the values it can have. It's candidly coarse semantics. Each institution applies it as it sees fit. And it works. An important characteristic. There's also edge-of-person entitlements. It's an extensible syntax for community-centered semantics. It gives much finer grain mechanisms. It may only be an IDP computed value. It may not exist in the enterprise directory. It may just be on the wire. It's very fertile ground for us to explore as a community. And finally, group memberships is member of. It's a single multi-valued attribute that contains group memberships. It enables a great deal of privacy options we never had before within collaborative processes. CLIR in particular, the software I'm about to demonstrate, is a joint effort of Internet 2 and Duke University. It emerged from a grant from NIST several years ago on scalable privacy. It gives end users mechanisms for both inline and self-serve, some of the stuff that the earlier speakers talked about in terms of user management, desiderata. It also allows effective enterprise management in both the presentation and the policies. When do users consent? When are other mechanisms for the basis for release? It has unexpected compliance benefits we didn't envision originally. It's open source software, and it's protocol neutral. It works very well with OAuth and OIDC, as well as with the SAML-based protocols. And I point out that the original SHIB t-shirt said we work for attributes. That's what we're trying to enable. This is just a slide of the APIs for CAR. For those of you who like APIs, there's one or two things to note about the users at the bottom are, here's the user and the self-serve console I'll demonstrate shortly. There's a manager who manages the overall installation, but you can delegate policy, for example, to librarians and have libraries directly manage access controls. We take the informed part of informed consent very seriously and have mechanisms for doing so. What I'm about to demonstrate now is seamless access followed by federated authentication several times for several users, user-controlled attribute release via CAR, and the admin interface that allows all this to work. So I'm going to switch to my browser, and I'm at my identity provider, Amber, and I'm about to go off to various resources and release attributes. The first, in different roles, the first resource I'm going to go to is a research and scholarship resource, but I'm going to go as an undergraduate. If I went as a faculty, I would not see a consent screen. I could see an informed screen, but the institutional policy for RNS sites is faculty attributes are released, undergraduates consent is required. We'll go in that role. I begin by using seamless access, and I'm going to pick my identity provider. It's a small list for this demo. I'm going to go in as an undergraduate. I give my password and I authenticate, and I should see a consent screen that indicates what attributes are being released to Research RS, the relying party I'm going to. You'll notice that we can permit or deny with CLIR indications. We display the values being released. We display the purpose of use, how the attributes are going to be used. The user has full control. It can suppress consent, as earlier speakers indicated in the desiderata, so you don't have to see this again. If you decide to change your mind, there is a self-serve console you can go to. So I can choose to suppress this. I'm going to save and continue, and then you see what the relying party has received. Research RS received the following attributes, which allowed for personalization, but I didn't release everything. I'm going to sign out now, and I'm going to log into a commercial content provider. And for those cases, I'm going to log in as a faculty member, and for there, you need access control, you need consent. And so I'm going to use seamless access again. This time I'm going to log on as a faculty member, and I'm presented with the consent screen, and there's some interesting aspects to this. Because of my role, I might want to display my departmental fund code to authorize internal license stuff such as Lexis. I might want to do personalization of a display name, but not identity. And I may have some group memberships that I want to use to bill or assess charges to various departments. So I can pick which group of my groups. Notice we suppress those because of GDPR requirements. I'm going to pick the Department of Math as the role I'm in right now, and I'm going to save and continue, and you'll see what was delivered to the relying party. Again, I got personalization, and I can get to LexisNexis because of it. I'm going to sign out again, and I'm going to go back and I'm going to look at my preferences for various roles, relying parties rather. I'm going to log in as the faculty member, And I'm now at a place where I can see what my settings have been. So here are the various sites I go to. If I want to revoke a policy, I can hit manage and I can change what I release to that site. I'm going to sign out. I'm going to show you one last capability. I'm going to go into the CAR admin UI, again, using seamless access one more time as the sysadmin, and show you where the policies are kept and indicate that for some of these policies, when do I release RNS? When do I release identity? I can delegate to other people the capabilities to manage these. There's a rich set of policies and it's an important capability. I will sign out as the sysadmin. In fact, I will go back to the PowerPoint and talk a little bit about what's still missing and more information. It's very hard to do selective release of values from group memberships. You saw that in our screen. We'd like a protocol that would manage that. The purpose of use taxonomy for research and education. Can we create a simple one that will serve many needs? Advertising did it. Can we do it? Fine-grained signaling of attribute needs and a few other needs and reporting utilities. And I'll close by providing websites that will give you more information. Thank you.